Hey everybody, this is Games Plus James, and today we're going to take a look at creating a water shader effect in Unity. The effect we're going for is the kind of look that we have at the bottom down here of just reflecting what's happening up above and giving a few nice ripples to the water surface as we go. So let's go ahead and dive in and see how we can do this. So I've got a starter project set up here. If you want to follow along with this, you can get a link to this project file in the description down below, or you can use your own files, it doesn't really matter obviously. So we're going to create this shader effect using shader graph, and to use that we need to be in the universal render pipeline. So if you haven't got that set up in your project, or you don't know how, very quickly all you do is go to Window, Package Manager. We need to make sure we have all packages here. Scroll down to the bottom, go to universal render pipeline and install that. Should just take a few moments. And once that's done, we can close out of our package manager, and then we need to go into our assets folder in our project. Well, it doesn't matter where in here you put it, but we're going to create rendering universal render pipeline and a pipeline asset, and we'll just leave that as the default one. And then we need to assign that to our graphics, so I need to go to Edit, Project Settings, and in Graphics we're going to add a render pipeline asset here. So I can just select the one that we just created, and if I go to Quality here, I'm also going to select in Rendering the render pipeline asset here. So that's it. We've got our project now set up to work with the universal render pipeline, and that means we can create shaders in the shader graph, which is really handy and really easy to use. So now that we have that set up, we'll dive into creating our shader in a moment, but the first thing we're going to do is make it so that we can capture the reflection that we want to use in our scene. And how we're going to do that is we're going to add another camera into our scene here, and then we're going to capture what that camera is seeing, obviously, and send it out to a render texture that's going to redraw the same image at the bottom of the screen. So for that, we're going to first of all set up the render texture that we'll use. So I'm going to go into my assets folder here. I'm going to create a render texture, and we'll call this the water render texture. And I need to adjust the size of this. So I'm going to make it, because it's going to be on the bottom of the screen, I'm going to make it really long, but not quite as high. So it's going to be, let's make it 2000 by 600 high. And then we're going to need a camera that will capture this. So I'm going to right click here, create a new camera. And on this camera, I'm going to go down to the bottom here, and where it has output, target is camera, I'm going to change this to texture. And then we have a slot here for our render texture. So I'm going to click and drag our render texture into there. And now in our camera view, you see we get a nice little preview of the camera here, and you can see if I we have our camera here, which is, oh, it's set to the wrong, there we go. I'm going to switch this to orthographic view, there we go. So if I zoom back in here, now we have the size of the camera here. So I'm going to make sure that this captures the top half of the screen, because that's what I want the water to reflect. So I'm going to move it up like this. And you'll see our camera view over here changes. Let's put it to about here, so we'll get a bit of the bridge that we can see as well. So everything this camera can see is what we're going to use to reflect in our water. So with that done, then I can go and go to my water texture here, and with my water render texture selected, you can see now this is showing what the camera can see. Okay, so we have our water render texture. The next thing we're going to need is the area that we want to act as our reflection. So let's go ahead and get a new sprite. So in my art folder here, I have just a blank white square that I'm going to drop into the scene. I'm going to set the order of this to 1 so that we can see it in our scene above the background that I have here. And I'm going to stretch this out. So I'm going to stretch it like so. And I'm going to stretch it up to about here. And what I need to do is actually line this up with the camera I just made. So I'm going to make it roughly the same size as the camera width. So I'm going to, I can see it needs to be a bit wider. So actually I'll just drag it up here so I can see the edges of the lines a bit better. So I need to it's roughly lined up with the left edge. Let's make that a little bit smaller, like so. And the right edge was a little bit more over here. You can see by the white outlines of the camera. It doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to be playing around with the texture a bit anyway, but we need to get it roughly similar to what the camera is. Okay, so with that done, then I can move it down into position. Oh, no, I'm moving the camera there. Let's undo that, and I'm going to grab the water sprite, and I'm going to put it down about here, and I want to line the bottom of this up with the top of, the top of this with the bottom of the camera. So I'm actually going to move it up here. Let's put it about here, and I'll move the camera down a bit more now to touch the top of it. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we want it to be pretty close for what we're doing. Okay, so we've got that set up. The next thing to do is make it so that we have a shader that's going to send some information to this blank white graphic to make it show our reflection. So we're going to go down here and to my assets folder. I'm going to create a new folder that we'll call water shader. Open this up, and I'm going to right click here. I'm going to create a shader 2D renderer, and we're going to do a sprite unlit graph because we don't want this to interact with lighting at all. We just want it to be unlit. So here we're going to call this the water reflection shader. And with this shader created, then we can go up here to open shader editor. So I'm going to open this up here, and it opens as a new tab. I'm going to undock this so I can just make it a bit bigger so we can all see things that are going on. And so you'll see in our shader editor here, we have a sprite unlit master. So this is the output that we're sending out that will be shown in the game. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the render texture that we have created, and we're going to put that in here and then send that out to our material. So for that, I'm going to right click here. I'm going to create a new node, and I'm going to search for a sample texture. So this is what we'll get. It'll take in a texture and send it out. So the texture we want to take in is the render texture. So for that, I'm going to create a reference to that up here. So up here, I'm going to go to the plus symbol and go to texture 2D, and we're going to call this render texture. So this is going to take in the render texture that we want to use. And I can drag this into our shader graph here, which creates a little node we can use. And then from here, I'm going to grab this and plug it into the texture input of our sample texture. And then I'm going to grab the output for all the colors and put this into the color output for the master node here. Now, what we'd really like is to be able to see this in our shader graphs, to be able to see the render texture that we're working on, so that we can get a bit of a preview of what's happening. So to do that, over here under default, I'm going to hit the circles here, and I'm going to select the render texture that we have created. So that's our water render texture here. Now, just in case that you can't see the circle here, the box might need to be resized. For me, it was by default like this, so I couldn't see the circle to be able to select something. So if you click on the bottom right corner here, you can drag this out to be able to see in your game or in your shader graph view. So you can see now that the render texture is being pulled in and it's been sent out to the master, and it's showing it here in our little preview. So I'm going to save this shader graph for the moment. I'm just going to drag this out of the way over here for just a moment here, and we're going to create a new material now that we can apply this to. So I'm going to create, oh no, not show in Explorer. I'm going to create a new material here, and we'll just call this the water reflection material, and I'm going to drag our shader graph onto it, so that'll automatically apply that shader to it. And now we have this water reflection. I can go to the water sprite that I dragged into the scene, and I can drag this material onto here, and now we have our reflection. So obviously at the moment you can see it's just repeating the same thing that it sees, that the camera sees up here. So if I just press play here, we can now see, oh, we've got our little character. We've essentially kind of got a split screen effect going on here. So let's just stop this running. I'm going to turn off maximize on play because we only need to see it down here in the bottom. But let's make it so that we can actually have a reflection going on in our shader graph here. So to do that, what we're going to do is use something called a tiling and offset node. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to right click again to create a node, or you can just hit the space bar, will bring up the node search. So I'm going to search for tiling and offset, and we'll select that here. Then I'm going to put the output of this into the UV of the sample texture. So the UV controls basically the position of the texture in our world. So by default, this will just be the standard tiling and offset, but we're going to adjust this so that this on the y-axis will be -1 for tiling. So we're basically saying, hey, it's going to be backwards and upside down. Now, obviously, this creates this weird effect here because we haven't adjusted the offset as well. So we need to adjust the offset to be 1. And what that basically does is now we have our upside down reflection. So let's save this asset. And now back in our game view, we now have our reflection working correctly. So there we go, very quickly and easily we now have a free and simple reflection that we can use in our game. But that doesn't give us the nice rippling water effect that we want. So to do that, we're going to do a whole different section within our shader graph. So I'm going to zoom out of this here, and I'm going to go over to the left over here. So what we're going to do now is create a texture that we're going to use to warp the surface of this water. So let's set that up first. So I'm going to go and create a new node here. I'm going to again take a sample texture that we're going to use here. And then what I'm going to do is create an input for it. So here I'm going to create a texture 2D that we'll call this the water texture, like so. And I'm going to give this a default water texture. So I've included in this download here a water texture file. If I just move this out of the way for a second, if we can just open this up here, you can see it's just a very simple little water kind of surface effect. You can use whatever you want for this really, and to be honest you don't have to use a water surface. There's actually a lot of cool things you can do with this and just play around and get some interesting effects, but we're going to use this for now. So I'm going to drag this water texture in here and use this as the input for the texture, so that gets us our little water effect here. Let me just drag this over so we can see our preview again, and I'm just going to drag this over to the left, and then I'm going to take the output of this and I'm going to bring this into the offset of our tiling and offset over here. And when you can see, this creates a bit of a different effect on our water surface. So I'm going to save this here just to see what this does. And you can see, well, in our view over here, this has actually created this weird kind of stretched out effect, which obviously isn't ideal for what we want. So we're going to have to make some slight modifications to how this works. So what we actually want this to do, first of all, is only affect our tiling and offset here on the x-axis. So at the moment you can see here, by default we're not making, or the way we have the reflection set up is to move it up by 1 on the y-axis, and we're not making any changes on the x-axis. So we're actually going to make changes to it on the x-axis. So if I do this, you can see what that actually does is move the surface around a little bit. So if I put that back to 0, we want to make this only affect the x-axis of our tiling here. So if I go here and create a new node, we can use a vector2 node with the output of this going to the offset here. So we're not going to change the y, we're going to set the y to be 1, but the x we're going to change by using this. So I'm going to drag the color here to this, and we get this, now we get this kind of slightly adjusted effect here. It's still really intense and not quite what we want, but I'm going to save it just to see how it looks in our scene view. So it's still getting this crazy huge lines, and you can see when we played around with the x-axis we were getting that in our preview here. So what's happening is it's still dragging it out too much, so we can kind of scale down the amount that's happening by creating a new input value first of all. So we'll create a vector1. So a vector1 is essentially like a float value, so it's just one value that it has. So we're going to create a, let's call this the refraction strength. So that's how much refraction is happening on the surface of our water. So I'm going to set this by default to be 1, and then I'm going to drag this into our scene here. Then we're going to use something called a remap node. So a remap node will kind of do some math calculations for us, and basically it's a complicated bit of thing, but we can just play around with it and use our refraction strength as an input here. And by playing around with the different values, I know that the x and y on the in here should be 0 and 1, and the x and y on the output here should be 0.02. And then I'm going to send this output and I'm going to combine it with the output of the sample texture here. And to combine two things like that, what we'll do is add a multiply node. So when we want to combine two things together, a lot of times we want to use a multiply node. So I'm going to unhook this from here and put this in as the B input, and I'm going to take the out here and put that in as the A input, and then I'm going to drag this output here into the X of our vector2. And now if I save this again, we should get on our scene view over here, we get our at the moment it looks blank and like nothing, because if I drag this shader graph down here and go back into our water shader and go to our reflection, we now have no water texture being assigned in here. So if I pop that on there, we now get, so this is part of why we were getting all those dashed lines across the surface here as well, was because we had no water texture, but that was still not what we wanted. But now that we have the water texture assigned, you can see we now have a bit of refraction happening. So if I go ahead and play the game here, and I'll maximize it as well, just so we can see things a little bit better. You can see as I move along, you can see the character is changing and being affected by the ripples on the water. So we now have the start of our water effect working. That's the basics of our water effect in place, of course. But water, we all know, doesn't just stand still. It does not move. We want our water effect to move on the surface, so we're going to make it move over time. So to do that, we're going to go over here. We're going to go ahead and use a couple of different nodes here. So I'm going to go over to the left here, and the first thing I'm going to do is add a time node. So we're going to add time. So this means, hey, this is something that will happen over the general course of time. We obviously want to be able to control how fast our water will move on the surface. So I'm going to add another variable, another vector1, that we'll call water speed. And again, by default, I'll have this at, I'm actually going to have it at 0.1 by default. And I'm going to drag this in here. So then we're going to combine these two together. So we're going to multiply our time by how fast we want our speed to go. So you can consider time kind of as time.delta time, as you might use in a normal script. So I'm going to create another node for multiply. So when you want to control the speed of something, you would usually get the speed that you're using and multiply it by time.delta time. So that's basically what we're doing here. So time input and our speed input. So now we have an output of how fast we want our thing to use. We can't just use the multiply here straight into our sample texture. If I just zoom in here into the UV, as we know, we saw up here, is controlled by our tiling and offset, or it controls our tiling and offset sort of. So if I use this as the UV here, you'll see we just get this kind of fading in and out black and white effect. So if I save the asset now, and if I were to play, we'll just see our water just kind of shifts around and jiggles, which obviously is not what we want. I'm going to turn off maximize and play here again. So instead of just directing that straight in there, let's just get that out. We're going to create a tiling and offset node again. So I'm going to create tiling and offset, and I'm going to pass this into the UV, and then we can control the offset of our texture like this. So now you can see we're starting to get a ripple effect going. So I can save this, and if I press play now, you can see, oh, we're starting to get a bit of a ripple action going on. And this works quite nicely. I kind of like how this looks, but basically what's happening here is we're just repeating the same texture over and over again. We can make it even more interesting by sort of randomizing a bit more this ripple effect. So I can stop this running here. Let's go back in here, and we're going to create a noise effect. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to create another node called gradient noise. So we'll do a search. You can see there's a couple of other different types of noise that you can use as well, but we're going to use a gradient noise, and that creates this little effect here. I'm going to control this on the x-axis, so we can make this zoom in to be different kind of sizes here. I'm going to zoom it in to be, let's say about 3-ish. Let's just set it as 3. You can play around with that and get whatever you want. And then we're going to add the noise effect and the multiplier together. So we're going to go here and select add node. And we're going to add both of these together. I'm going to unhook this from the offset here. And now I'm going to put the output of this into the offset. So now you can see we get this kind of cool rippled effect. So we're using the texture that we had rippled, and we're using the gradient noise that we have here, and combine them together to get this kind of more complicated looking water surface. So we can play around with this as well. You can obviously increase it really high, gets way more complicated, and we can pull it way down low, and it returns to the sample texture that we had before. So you can combine them in interesting ways and kind of do whatever you want. And this, you can see here, We could also use another texture if we wanted here and stuff like that, but we're just going to stick with this nice little gradient noise that we have. So now I can save this out, and now we have a completely dynamic water surface that we're using. So if I go ahead and play, let's just, oops, didn't mean to do that. Let me just drag this out of the way here for a second. So now we have our water surface. I'm going to actually just make it bigger so we can see a bit more of what's going on. We now have this water surface moving and shaking around a little bit more randomly and a little bit more interesting than what we had before. So we now have our water effect pretty much done. There's one final thing, which is the water surface. Generally speaking, when you see water, it's not a perfect reflection of what's going on around you. At least especially in a game, you expect it to not be a perfect representation of what's going on. Now you can change that by using the water sprite that we have here. For example, we could change the color of it. We could make it darker, we could make it red, or we could do whatever we wanted. But we'd obviously rather do this through the actual shader itself. So let's go back into our shader. And right at the end here, we're going to take in a color value. So I'm going to go here and create a new color value. So hit color here, and we're going to say, well, we'll just leave this as color. It doesn't really need to change. And I'm going to drag this above our sample texture. And then we're going to combine these two together. So when we want to combine them, most of the time we want to use is a multiply. So we're going to multiply these together. So we're going to take the color as one input and the texture as the other input here. And I'm going to send this out to the sprite master. You can see what's happened here is there's nothing showing up, and that's because our default color is black with no alpha. So I'm going to make this white with full alpha, and there we go. We now have it showing up down here. So I'm going to save this asset now. You can see there's nothing different in our scene just yet. So I'm going to close the shader graph at this point because we're done creating the shader. And now in our material over here, we can adjust the color. So we can make it a little bit darker, and we can make it a little bit blue as well, because obviously it's water. And we can also, if we want to, pull the alpha value down. So we can make it completely transparent, or we can make it semi-transparent. So now you can see things behind the water, and you can still see the player reflecting up above. So I'm going to make it a little bit transparent, like so. So now if I go ahead and play, we'll see we now have a nice water effect appearing. We can see through it, and it's updating constantly and showing us exactly what's going on. So there you go. With just a little bit of work in Unity's shader graph editor, we can create a really cool water surface effect. I hope you find this video useful and you can go ahead and apply the same ideas to your games. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more tutorial goodness here on the channel. And in the meantime, keep being awesome, and I'll see you all very soon.